To our viewers, thank you so much for tuning in to the third episode of Meet the Professor, where I interview philosophy professors about their research and why philosophy is important. Today we have Professor Sinnott Armstrong of Duke University. He works in both neuroscience and philosophy and writes about a wide variety of philosophy, including skepticism, consequentialism, epistemology, among other subjects. Thank you so much for being here, Professor Sinnott Armstrong.
Glad to be here. I'm glad you're doing these interviews.
Thank you. So to get things started, I wanted to ask, how did you become interested in philosophy and sort of what was your first introduction?
My very first introduction was when I was a student at a prep school called Hotchkiss, the Hotchkiss School. And I decided that I was taking nothing but science. And so I would take a term off in the spring term of my senior year. I'd already gotten into college and decided I would take a little philosophy course. There were only four of us and we read things together and I enjoyed it very much. So then I got to college and met my mentor, Bill Kinnick, and couldn't get enough of it after that.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So I think the answer is it's all about teachers. You know, a good teacher will get you interested in philosophy. A bad teacher will make you think philosophy is a waste of time.
Yeah. Now, why do you think students in general should pursue philosophy?
Well, I think there are many reasons to pursue philosophy. Just curiosity is one of them. These are important issues in our lives and people don't think about them often enough. But if you wanted to wrap it up into one particular slogan, I would say that philosophy is that area where people construct an overall worldview. They want different parts of their life to fit together. You want to study physical objects, you go to physics. You want to study minds and how they work, you go to psychology. You want to figure out how the physical world relates to the mental world, you come to philosophy. You want to study political value and fairness, you go to political science. You want to study aesthetic value and what makes a work of art good, you probably go to art history or art classes. But if you want to study what is value in general that applies to justice as well as beauty, that's what philosophers talk about. So I think philosophy is great for bringing together different fields and trying to formulate an overall view that includes them all.
Yeah, that definitely is a great reason. Now, once students are interested and they want to further pursue their curiosity, what sort of resources should they look into, whether that be publications, papers, podcasts, etc.?
Well, there are just tons of them out there. You can go on YouTube and put in philosophy and you'll get a lot. The one that I would mention in particular, because not everybody catches up with it, is a site called Wi-Fi, WI-PHI, where people give very introductory level and very short and accessible lectures, often illustrated by animation, in order to explain the basic concepts of philosophy. So check out Wi-Fi. I think all your listeners should look at it because it gets overlooked. And a former student of mine helped develop it. So I'll admit I'm prejudiced.
Yeah, that definitely sounds very cool and very interesting that you inspired it. So now I wanted to move a little bit into your research. I know you've done a lot of research in both like neuroscience and ethics. So how has your work on neuroscience impacted your work on ethics, if at all? And like more broadly, should science be an important concern in ethics?
Absolutely. I think, let me give you an example. Okay. One thing that fascinated me when I was young was I grew up in a town, Memphis, where there was a lot of racial prejudice and discrimination. And I couldn't understand how people who were good people, and they were good people, could be so prejudiced against these people just because their skin's darker than ours. Like, what's up with that? Well, one thing philosophy can do is study when that's wrong, why it's wrong, how we should react to it, all those normative questions. But neuroscience can help us understand why people believe that. How did we end up holding such different views and holding those views so strongly about important issues. Neuroscience and psychology can help us understand how we got here. And then philosophy can tell us what we ought to do about it. What are the normative questions of how do you deal with it? So I think they really work hand in hand, because if you don't understand how we got here, you can't really figure out what we ought to do about it.
Yeah, that makes sense. The intersection between science and philosophy is definitely very interesting. Another place that I know you've done research in and written about is moral skepticism. Could you explain some of what you've done in that area?
So I'm a contrastivist. Actually, if you go to Wi-Fi, I did the lectures on contrastivism. So what that means is when you have a reason to believe something or a reason to do something or a reason why something happened, an explanation, then it's always relative to a certain contrast. So do I know that those are bricks on the wall that I can see right outside my window here? Well, they're painted white, but I know they're bricks, right? Because I can see them and they look like bricks. Wait a minute, they could be fake bricks. They could be something else. It could be a facade that's painted to look just like it. How do I know that it really is that thing? Well, a contrastivist says you do know that they are bricks as opposed to grass, right? If you're trying to decide where can you run, but you don't know that they are bricks as opposed to an imitation of bricks that you can't tell from the real thing. So skepticism says what we need to understand is the limits of knowledge. And I think the limits of knowledge are explained in terms of these contrasts. We do know some things as opposed to others, but we don't know them as opposed to still others. And so to get clear about what we know and what we don't know, you have to look at these contrasts. And when you do that, you have to recognize that for some contrasts, like are those real bricks or fake bricks? I don't really know. That's where the skepticism comes in. Some things we don't know, other things we do know. Our knowledge is always limited because there are always some fakes we can't exclude. And recognizing that gives us humility and helps us better understand our place in the world.
Yeah. Lastly, I know another area of research you've done work into is consequentialism, and you've given a couple of arguments for it. Could you give us some insight into what those were and why you think they're persuasive?
Well, the arguments are complex and would take a long time. So I'll just refer to my mother. My mother used to always say, you know, Walter, don't worry about it. That's water under the bridge. Uh, and what that meant, because we grew up on the Mississippi River and water would go under the bridge very quickly. And once it's past the bridge, you can't do anything about it. It's off and gone. And the idea was that if you really want to think constructively about what you ought to do in the world, you should be trying to make the world a better place. You should think about the future and not worry so much about the past. Well, that's what consequentialism does. Consequentialism worries about the future and what it's going to be like and whether people are going to be happy and whether they're going to be alive and whether they're going to have other values like friendship and knowledge and so on. Whereas other views go, hey, in the past, you made a promise and you've got to stick with it. Well, wait a second. That's water under the bridge. You know, what you did in the past. Let's think what we should do now to make the world better. And I just always had that inclination, probably because of the way my mama raised me.
That's very interesting. Now that I know you have a broad variety of interests, so I'd be interested to know who is your favorite historical philosopher or historical or contemporary philosopher?
Well, I mean, I a little peculiar, but I would say Henry Sidgwick. Have you ever even heard of Henry Sidgwick? A lot of people haven't heard of Henry Sidgwick. Have you?
Yeah, I've heard a little bit about him. Yeah.
There you go. So Henry Sidgwick was a consequentialist, but a sophisticated consequentialist who had a very subtle way of handling objections to consequentialism. And he raised a bunch of new issues, extremely influential. His book, Methods of Ethics, was read for the first half of the 20th century, was kind of standard text for everybody who studied moral philosophy in the UK and other places as well. extremely influential. Part of the reason he's one of my heroes is that he helped out women in philosophy. People don't know this, but a bunch of local women came, wanted to listen to his lectures. The registrar told him, no, you can't have women in your classes. That's ridiculous. And so what he did is he said, that's ridiculous. And he had the women come to his chambers in the evening, and he repeated his lectures for those women. He encouraged the other faculty to do the same, and fought and fought. And 10 years later, Cambridge admitted women. And when he died, he left a lot of his fortune to start the first women's college at Cambridge. So people like Henry Sidgwick, they are philosophers, but they're not just philosophers. They try to get out there and make the world better. And that's one reason I really admire him, in addition to his great book.
Yeah, I think that's very interesting about how we thought abstractly, but then also applied it and how we actually made decisions in the real world. I think that's all the questions I have for today. Thank you so much for agreeing to do this. Thank you.
Thank you for having me, and thanks again for creating this series.